colleague. We were in graduate school together and have stayed associated over the years. My very good friend, Dr. Stephen Wernke, he's an assistant or associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Vanderbilt University. He got his bachelor's at the University of Iowa, his PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he had a postdoc after that at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Wernke is quite active. We were just talking about, he just got a teaching award, talking about researchers, and like he's an excellent teacher as well as researcher. He got a, in the time of COVID, award for his teaching. And he has received the SAA Book Award for his excellent book, Negotiated Settlements, Andean Communities and Landscapes Under Inca or Spanish Colonialism, with the University of Florida Press, University Press Florida. He's published in all our big venues and others, Journal of Archaeological Science, Latin American Antiquity, Human Ecology. He has some 50 plus articles and chapters. And he is, along with me, an editor, co-editor of the book series with University of Arizona Press, The Archaeology of Indigenous Colonial Interactions in the Americas, which we're very proud the books that we're getting in that series. Funding, wow. It just kept going down the CV. So he's had great internal support for his work through Vanderbilt and other, and externally. He has NEH, NSF, he has an NSF DDIG, NIH, National Museum of Ethnology in Japan. He got an in-residence writing fellowship, very, very active grantor. Early on, he was really plum. I mean, probably one of the most prestigious posts for a Latin American specialist, the Harvard University Dumbarton Oaks Research Library fellowship. He's also gotten a Wenner-Gren. I remember when you were writing that, Steve, when we were graduate students. And his focus is on colonialism and imperialism, GIS, and his specialties, digital and computational archaeology, community and landscape and land use. And today we're just really, really excited to have Steve present his current work and take it away, Steve.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay, you're seeing full screen out there? Great. Well, thank you so much, Liam. It's a real pleasure to do this with you all at UNLV. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. You made me blush a little bit, but thank you. Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Alan. Thank you, Esther, for your work in helping set this all up. It's really been a pleasure. So yes, I'm going to speak to you all today about colonialism in the Andes, in the Andean region of South America, where I've been working for some 25 years now, thinking back, in the same valley with the same communities now for a long time. And so I want to sort of speak to the life cycle of a colonized place. It's a book project I'm working on that I'm kind of I'm placing in the framework of an archaeological microhistory of a detailed history of this particular community. Okay, it is a story of displacement, and so for that reason, and just out of general decency, right, I should also acknowledge the displacements of the native peoples where I'm currently sitting, right? So Vanderbilt University is located on the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Shawnee, and other native peoples who were forcefully displaced from these lands to lands west of the Mississippi River in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And and it's interesting to think about the different ways that colonialism has manifested in the Americas. In North America, that's a big part of the story of one of displacement by pushing people out of the way, right, is the mentality. And what the English were really after were resources. And the Spanish worked through people. There's a different relationship between the crown, the state, and the church. So the church, the Catholic Church required for legitimate colonization quote unquote legitimate colonization to occur, the whole idea was that you had to convert the populace to Catholicism, right, for legitimate colonization. And so we see this manifested in the way that Spanish colonialism proceeds through people and through settlement. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the way that Spanish urbanism manifests in this colonization project through the largest, what's probably the largest mass resettlement program by a colonizing power in world history, what's known as the general resettlement of Indians in the Peruvian Viceroyalty. I'll get to that. So just a brief overview of where we're going. So I want to speak to the issue of colonizing narratives, meta-narratives. I mean, whenever we speak of the colonization of the Americas, we're faced with 500 years of what the colonizers have said about it. So when you sit down to say anything about it or write anything about it, the weight of that really should be foremost on our minds and how that influences how we think about it. And so that's part of what motivated me for taking a micro-narrative approach to speak to the local story here and how that might be a counter to these framing narratives that we often fall into, right? So as a kind of counter to that. Then I want to talk about how they're called reducciones, which literally means reduction, but it has a broader meaning than that I'll get to. How these reduction villages fit or did not fit into the landscape. Then I'll speak to the birth of this particular reducción, this particular town, how it was built a little bit, what it was like to live there through a variety of sort of spatial analytical kinds of approaches, because the architectural preservation is quite good, so we can actually do that in a lot of detail. And then what happened when it fell apart? What happened inside, in this case, this town, and the story around that, and then how it was resurrected in a different location. So there's this sort of Christological Christian narrative, which is actually the narrative that people use in the village today, actually. So it is a narrative that is directly guided by the descendant population today. So that's where we're going. Okay, so a little bit on meta-narrative and micro-narrative. Yeah, so as I say, you know, the weight of this, of what has been said before is very much present in my mind when I think about how to approach a problem like this. I mean, it was a massive project, and a lot of how we think about Spanish colonialism in the Andes today is a product of this Reducción General, or the general resettlement in the Viceroyalty of Peru, which occurred in the 1570s. In one decade, over 1.5 million people in the Andes were forcefully resettled into over 1,000 towns that were built, again, in one decade in the 1570s, under the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, who was the 5th Viceroy of the Viceroyalty of Peru, which at that time was basically all of Western South America. He was sent by the Council of the Indies in Spain to establish a kind of institutional structure for colonialism in the Viceroyalty after a generation of a lot of infighting amongst conquistadores and their descendants, and the abuses and corruption that came with their indirect rule. And so this was part of a centralization project as well. And so how have we written about this? It's gone from like triumphalist framings of this project in the early 20th century, like, oh, he was the great rationalizer of colonialism in Peru, through mid-century narratives of, well, this was a horrible project of oppression. It was a way to reduce people to control them, to extract tribute from them. The tribute system in Peru is based on a census. It was a head count, and you as an Indian subject, and they use the word Indian, right? So the Indian subject, you by dint of being an Indian owed the king your tribute, right? And so this was a way to foster the collection of tribute, foster conversion to Catholicism, and surveillance of the population in general. Through narratives of resistance to that in the mid-century and on through narratives of negotiation. In other words, it's sort of a counter to a writing of just resistance, to start to think about how it was that this project came into articulation with local politics, and that indigenous peoples brought their full political subjectivity to this as well. So that's kind of where we've been over the span of the 20th into the 21st century, and I've contributed to that last bit of it. But a persistent question through all this has been sort of the Reducion General as a project is, did it succeed or did it fail, right? And it's sort of what I'm arguing in this book is, well, that's kind of the wrong question to ask. I mean, it really succeed or fail based on whose position, right? Did it succeed? Yeah, I mean, it really depends on who you ask, obviously, right? So the questions should be much more subtle than that. I'm interested in how it was that, on the one hand, the thinking behind what motivated this project, right, was to not just use the built environment as a kind of marker for civilization, that it would reflect a kind of order that we were imposing on the landscape, but that by building these towns, it would actually bring about, it would be a generative process, right? So the idea was a very deterministic kind of notion of what the built environment can do. If we build these towns, they will become properly civilized, right? Is the idea. So I call this the sort of build it and they will become model subjects, i.e. good Christians and good tribute producers for the king, right? Now, of course, this gets very complicated very quickly because, of course, Andean peoples had their own experiences working with an imperial power just a generation previous under Inca rule. And the Incas also brought concepts of urbanism. And so, and we can get into the details of how specifically they overlap in certain kinds of outward formal ways as well. Plazas, the use of plazas was central in Inca imperialism. This was where the Inca would perform their generosity, their quote unquote generosity vis-a-vis subject peoples, and in return you owed the Inca tribute. So it was really through the plaza that the motor force of Inca imperialism occurred. Of course, the plaza is central to Spanish urbanism, and also it's a space for the performance of elaborate Catholic rituals. So urban spaces are kind of these spectacular spaces for producing what they called policia, a form of social order, right? So in both cases, we have sort of embodied spatial politics and the use of pageantry and ritual and the idea of bringing new habits into being. But the Reducion is not just about these towns. It was part of this much broader kind of ideology around the idea of bringing order, right, to what they perceived as a kind of lack of order, right? So you could actually translate Reducion as conversion, right? So they even use this term Reducion for grammars. When the early mendicant friars wrote down Maya languages, they called those grammars reducciones of the language. In other words, they were aligning these indigenous languages to within a linguistic ideology that places Latin, as closest to divinity, and aligning these general languages of Indigenous Americans in that ideology, right? And trying to find the rules and the structures of these languages. So you could say that it's a kind of semiotic ideology, Reducion. And the idea here is that urban form is a producer of civic community. It's a kind of divine order that can be instantiated in the built environment. So the question becomes, then, how is this universalist vision, how is it implemented in situ, in place? We haven't had a lot of sustained work on this. So we're just getting started, I would say, on a generational basis. There's a big push right now in the Andes to try to understand these processes, and I'm just a part of that. What I'm interested in here on the part of the indigenous community then is how they receive this, right? And I would argue that it's more than just a kind of appropriation of these forms or kind of mimicry or syncretism, that instead there is a kind of ingestion of these colonial forms, so much so that they become part of what it means to be a local indigenous person, so that peoples today will identify with their village primarily. And that becomes a way to assert your rights vis-a-vis the state today. So, again, was it a success or a failure? Well, I mean, it certainly was a success in hearing these values into people, but they deployed them through their own politics, right? So in the Andes, there's a long-standing tradition of invaders from foreign lands becoming ancestral to one's community. So this is a part of that much longer process of ingestion. So in that sense, of course, people participate in their own colonization, but through that participation and because of people's cultural lights that they move to, they also can deploy those same forms to be partially emancipated from it, is kind of the trunk line of my argument. Now, how do these fit into these landscapes? These, of course, the audacity of this is that the Spanish thought that they were imposing order in a landscape without it, but of course it was a landscape that was already made through thousands of years of terracing, of irrigation systems. This is on the western slopes of the Andes, where irrigation agriculture had developed since around the first centuries of the current era, and have been elaborated into some of the largest irrigated landscapes in the Americas. In the high altitude, you have these bofedales, these high altitude marshes where you see our llamas and alpacas today. And so you have, on the one hand, agriculturalists who are committed to these really intensive agriculturalist systems. And in the high altitude, you have pastoralists who need to move around with their flocks. So this sets up long-term sort of political, ecological incompatibilities between compact nucleated towns, dispersed agricultural holdings, and really dispersed pastoralist lifeways. So just to place us geographically, we're on the western slopes of the Andes. You can see Lake Titicaca there on the right. And so we're on the semi-arid western side of the Andes, moving down through. This is the area around the city of Arequipa in the Colca Valley, which is one of the largest drainages going down to the Pacific Ocean. It was the homeland of two different ethnic groups, the Coyaguas and the Cabanas. The Coyaguas were subdivided between two sub-ethnic groups called Lari Coyaguas and Yanque Coyaguas. They were an Aymara-speaking peoples. The Cabanas in the lower part of the valley were Quechua-speaking peoples. So these are two different linguistic groups occupying the same valley, really close to one another. Really large populations, something on the order of 60,000 people on the eve of the Spanish invasion. And they were resettled into these little pink blobs. Here are the Reducion villages. So they went from hundreds of hamlets, villages, and towns into some 24 towns in 24 reducciones in the colonial era. And what you see there is where people still reside. I mean, there was people moved away from them over time, but by and large, people still live in these colonial towns, except for the case of Mount Chuyakta up here where we're going, which was abandoned in the 1840s, as we'll see. So I'll give us a really quick tour up the valley from Cabana lands in the west and on up the valley. So this is what they look like. These nucleated, gridded towns built around a plaza and a church. I think you could probably make that out there. On this big alluvial terrace over the inner river gorge of the Colca River. This is about 3,000 meters above sea level. As we go up the valley, this is one of the next towns up called Madrigal. Again, a gridded town. This is prime maize agricultural landscape around this part of the lower part of the valley. If we move up a little further, the town of Lari, which was the capital of Lari Coyaguas. And then on up to Wernke, where I've spent a couple of years doing earlier research, the capital of the whole province and capital of Wernke Coyaguas. And if we continue up, this is across the valley from Wernke, the village of Coporaque. So you get a sense, these are gridded towns built around plazas and churches. And so finally, we're up here at Tuti, where this current project is situated. You see the modern town here, but this dates to 1843. The original town, the original Tulane and Reducion from the 1570s is up in this high basin. Now we're up way high in the upper reaches of the valley, where it's even above agricultural limits for the most part. The town of Mount Chuyakta, you've heard of Machu Picchu. Machu just means, or Mauchu, same word, just means ancient or old, and Yakta means, in Quechua, means, old community or town, basically. So this is what the descendant community calls their old town. They recognize this as their old town. There are very specific oral histories around it that are very, very, very interesting. So I wanted to tell this story of the Reducion of Mount Chuyakta, and from beginning to end. And so the birth of this town is very, very interesting. It starts with the Spanish invasion, where we have a series of smaller settlements, as elsewhere in the valley and all around the Andes. People tended to be more dispersed in smaller communities. And in this case, we have the Auqui. If you look towards the left here, Auqui, Marca, and Malata. These were the towns where people lived right on the eve of the Spanish invasion, and they were partially resettled into a smaller number of basically missions. They're technically not missions; they were called doctrinal settlements, where Franciscans came to the valley in the 1540s, and there was an initial pulse of settlement concentration under Franciscan evangelization between the 1540s and the 1560s. So my earlier research looked at that process at settlements like Malata there. So you can see on the left, this is the Franciscan doctrinal settlement with this church there on the left, and the houses. And so if you look right at the bottom there, you see the houses are sort of in a row. They're almost like streets, right? So we found that those were added on in the colonial occupation in that first generation after the Spanish invasion. Now, as we get towards the middle of the site, you see these more circular structures, more in an aggregated sort of formation. That's the old Inca core of the site. And if you look to the left, you might be able to make out this building here, which is an Inca ceremonial building, and its plaza out in front of it. And then, of course, to the right is the Spanish, really small, it's like 10 meters long, rustic little chapel with its atrium that was built after the fact. Initially, it was just the church on the hillside, and then that enclosing atrium was built during a remodeling episode. So that's where people were resettled initially into these small doctrinal settlements. And then there was this pulse of resettlement under the general resettlement of Toledo in the 1570s. And as near as we can tell, there were actually two Reducion villages in this part of the valley. One was called Coimo, and the other one was called Santa Cruz de Tuti. And what's interesting is Coimo disappears from the documentation after the initial protocols for resettlement were written up. So we have censuses from the 1590s. The first census after the resettlement program was in 1591, and Coimo doesn't appear in that, but Santa Cruz de Tuti does. So we think that this was like a failed reduction right very early on, and those people were then resettled up from Coimo. Here's Coimo or Laika. Down here, I'll show you a couple of more detailed images here with its big church. Now, this is a 30-meter long church, much bigger, with a nave and an apse and so forth, down in this flat basin amongst the terracing. So this was abandoned sometime between the 1570s and 1590s, and then we believe people were resettled again up through up to Santa Cruz de Tuti, which was already there as a reduction. So there were people who were, over the course of just a couple of generations, resettled perhaps 3 times, from Alquimarca to Malata, Malata to Laika, and then Laika to Mauchiyacta. So it's like, you know, displacement after displacement. And so these were people who were brought up from the agricultural zone to this high altitude setting. This is the settlement today. You see this green stripe running through it. That's the high altitude marsh that runs through the settlement itself, which is a significant feature that I'll talk about later. But it's this big gridded town. It's about half a kilometer on a side. And it was, this is an aerial photo from 1931. The Shippey Johnson aerial expedition flew through the valley. We're actually working on a paper right now where they did overlapping vertical air photos, and we've processed those into a giant mosaic of the valley in 1931. We have a 25 centimeter resolution air photo of the whole valley from their work. But they went straight to these ruins. They didn't know what they were, but they were very curious about them. And literally their first flight in the valley, they beelined it for this because they noticed it when they first scouted around. And so I saw this photo in the archives way back when I was working on my dissertation. I didn't know where the site was until I figured out the flight sequence. And then I walked up there in 2004 and I saw, oh, there it is, there's the site. So my long-term vision was to work at this settlement to tell this story. So yeah, it's at 4,100 meters above sea level. So it's at 14,000 some feet above sea level, very high altitude. This is what we call the Puna in the Andes, high altitude grasslands with these high altitude marshes, the bofedales. And so it's about half a kilometer on the side, just the settlement itself, but the larger area is about 40 hectares in size. And it's this very regular grid. You can make out even where there aren't houses, it's gridded. And we think what they did is, you know, the Spanish administrator, the visitador, the person who was in charge of the actual resettlement, ordered the regular grid to be built, and then we think probably basically left it to the local community to build their domestic spaces as they saw fit within that. So so we see that they're building these blocks on what's called a cordel, which is a 50 Spanish yards. They're very regular in their layout. And as you see, the architectural preservation is really is very good. So early on, I wanted to think about how to approach mapping this. And so this was early in the years of drone photography and drone mapping and stuff. So along the way, we did some drone videos and we scared a lot of cattle, as you can see down there in the lower left. But this gives you a sense of the scale of the settlement, right? And just how audacious this was to resettle over 1,000 people into this high altitude setting from down below, from all around the Puna, into this planned colonial town. You can make out the church there, the regular grid of domestic buildings. There you get a sense of the scale with some folks from our excavations walking in the actual parish compound. That's the sacristy there to the right and the church nave itself. So we excavated the sacristy and the rectory where the priests resided, and several domestic contexts at the site as well. You can see the houses. And so we focused our efforts so far in what we believe were the domestic spaces of indigenous leaders, what are known as curacas in the Andes, or chieftains, or lords, Andean lords. And this building that's kind of in the center right now that you can see is a little cleaner, we excavated that space, which would have been like a formal house for receiving guests. And that curaca got an entire block, you can see, for themselves. And then there's an outbuilding there, which we believe was the kitchen. Well, was the kitchen. And so one of the points here is that, you know, colonialism proceeded through the figure of the curaca, of the Andean lords, as indirect indigenous intermediary elites in these spaces. Okay. So yeah, so based on our mapping efforts and so forth, we've mapped over 500 buildings. We've also, through a lot of surface collections, as you'll see, we've established that it was built on top of, literally on top of, a big Inca, probably administrative center. And so they're recycling the spaces. The Spanish were building where there was already an important node of Inca administration. So and it was occupied through the all the way through to the early years of the Peruvian Republic, which begins in 1821. So for 22 years, it was it extends into the 22 years of the Republican era as well. So what's important to think about then is that, in terms of its setting, is that yes, it's very high altitude. You can see these bunch grasses. This is where the Ichu bunch grass grows. This is the pastoralist altitudes of the Andes, where you have, you know, long-standing pastoralist traditions, where you have llama caravanners and alpaca herds people who attend to their flocks. All right, and then you have agriculture down below in the breadbasket of the valley itself. So based on that, we can start to think about who was specifically living there and who got displaced more, essentially, right? So we have a really rich series of colonial censuses. We probably have more colonial censuses for the Colca Valley than any other locale in the New World in terms of a sequence of them. And within that sequence, this village is among the best documented. So what's interesting here is the Spanish colonial administration is built right on top of indigenous social organization. So a community in the Andes is not one thing, it's two things. It's two communities that are interacting with each other, two moieties. Anansaya, an upper moiety, a higher ranking side, and Udinsaya, a lower ranking moiety, okay? So a community is always two things in complementary opposition. To think of a community as one thing doesn't make sense in the Andes. And so you have a whole hierarchy of political leadership within each of those that are in parallel. And the censuses are done on the basis of those moieties. So we have a census from Anansaya and a census from Udinsaya from slightly different years. We don't have them from the same years, but pretty close. Okay, so for the upper moiety, the higher ranking moiety from 1617, and for Udinsaya, the lower moiety from 1604. This is what they look like. Just in terms of the, you know, what the documents look like. They're very, very systematic. They're grouped then inside of each moiety by a sort of lineage-like formation known as the Ayu. In the Andes, the basic kin unit is called an Ayu, which is a very scalable unit. But you can think of it as a kind of ancestor-focused lineage. And then underneath each Ayu, so here's the village of Coporake. You can see that pretty easily. Here's an Ayu called Coyana. And then there's the curaca, the head person for the Ayu is listed first, his wife, his kids, and then their land holdings for every household. Okay, so the field sizes, the crop that they grew there, and then their location by place name of each field. So they declared their land holdings and the number of livestock and what type of livestock it was. So from that, just in terms of summary statistics, we know that there are about 1,000 people in 1604/1617 between the two halves of the village. So just over 1,000 people, but 2/3 of it is from the upper moiety. So the higher ranking moiety is 2/3 of the population, not half. So that's important to keep in mind. If we look inside of that, then each of the different IUs, okay, these are the named IUs underneath each of the two moieties. And what's interesting is, okay, they're ranked within that. So this is the ranking IU within Anansaya. The names aren't that important for us right now. And this is the ranking IU for Udinsaya. And that means that the IU head person is responsible for collecting tribute for the entire moiety. And what we see is the ranking IU of Anansaya, the upper ranking moiety, is almost 40% of the village, or it's almost half of the village. It's like 47%, I want to say. It's 466 people from that single IU, right, is from the ranking IU of the upper moiety. So they resettled people to where the ranking IU was and the largest IU, right? Now the ranking IU from Udinsaya, the lower ranking moiety, is rather small but interesting in another way. Okay, so if we look at the livestock declarations, right? So here are the two to watch: Pahana Kaloka and Taipi Pataka. So Pahana Kaloka has high per capita livestock, so they were primarily pastoralists. And then if we look over here at Taipi Pataka, they are the highest in Udinsaya. So we have the two pastoralist IUs as the ranking IUs. So they built this town where the ranking pastoralist IUs were located, if that makes sense. Now, if we look at field holdings, we see that the lower ranking moiety, these IUs have a lot of per capita field holdings. So they're primarily agriculturalists, right? And there's one in Anansaya that has a lot of, well, not a lot, but they have a fair number of field holdings. So the thing to think about here then is we have displaced agriculturalists from down low that are getting really, really moved away from their agricultural land holdings. So they're having to walk now over an hour a day just to get to their fields. And that's one of the things I'll look at in a lot of detail. Okay, so what was it like so that's a little bit on sort of the establishment of the town. What was it like to live there? Because we have such good architectural preservation, we wanted to do this really detailed mapping using drone photography as a base map, which then results in this orthomosaic that gives us great resolution. We then go out and use that as a base map and map in the field lots of different attributes on every building. What kind of masonry is there? What are the wall joins like, and all that. So we did a GIS of all the buildings. And so on those 507 buildings, we have a whole bunch of data that we recorded with that. And then we did surface collections in 2013, I believe it was. So we have like over 900 surface collections where we, in a radius, collected everything we could see on the surface. And then we also collected everything we could see inside the buildings. And that we can then interpolate that into a density surface that looks like this. So this is just looking at Inca ceramics, where we sort of have hotspots of Inca ceramics. And it's pretty obvious here we've got a hotspot to the south and one to the north here, right? So this is Inca material in relation to this colonial overlay, right? So this is maybe where the older parts of the sites are, right? And what's interesting here is we know that all the other reducciones in this valley and many other valleys, you see this Anansaya, Udinsaya moiety organization grafted on spatially onto the grid of the town. And so this is something we started to think about, and we started to think about in relation to the center of the site of the settlement. So this is curious. You would think the middle of the site would be where the grid would be the most regular, where it would conform to the perfect checkerboard the most, but it's actually where it least conforms to it. And so what's going on here? If we zoom in, well, one of these plazas is trapezoidal. And so, you know, to any Andeanist, when you see trapezoids, you think it's like the Inca was here, right? And so this was the Inca Plaza at the center of the site. And if we plot the distribution of cut stone masonry that is like Inca cut stone masonry, it's restricted only to this part of the site as well. So this was a BA honors thesis that Will McCullum did a few years back, looking at the distribution of cut stone masonry. So we think that, yeah, it's literally recycling the original Inca Plaza in the center of the Reducion itself. The entire grid then of the Reducion is oriented to this original Inca Plaza, right? So if we think about imposition, well, it's not just imposition. This is also about acknowledging the power of this space, this former Inca imperial and doctrinal space. And we know from Inca settlement planning elsewhere that there was a ceremonial platform associated with plazas. Sometimes they're in the center of the plaza, sometimes they're to a side, and we have some interesting features over here. And then very likely there was some form of administrative architecture off of the plaza that would perhaps we would call a concha, which is sort of like the Inca concept of a compound, of a domestic compound or an administrative complex compound like that. Okay, so that's the center of the town. And then in the parish inventory, we have an actual reading out of this space, like even street names are given. So it says, okay, we have where the we have the house of the priest, the Casa de Curas. And it says, and so it sort of reads out the space in relationship to that as the center. And it says there's the Royal Plaza out in front of it. Then it is bisected by something called the Royal Street, the Calle Real. And then it says, oh, there's another Calle Real that runs behind the church complex. So you have these two Calle Reales, or royal streets. And then it says, there are two fountains or wells. These are wells like Hansel and Gretel wells, literally, it looks like that on the ground. And then there's a cross pedestal out here in what they call the plazuela, which is like a minor plaza or a small plaza, which is kind of ironic because this is like an artificially leveled, huge infrastructural project to level this that was, of course, built with the labor of the community. And then there are 6 chapels off of that, or on that plazuela. One is the Miser Chapel, the mortuary chapel that aligns with the lateral portal of the church, and the cross pedestal here. Okay, so this is what it looks like if you just climb up the hillside, where we would set up our total station sometimes. So we got used to this view of it. You can see this is our Inca Plaza, and then the church complex, the plazuela just beyond. Now, we know very specifically how this would have been used. What's really, really interesting is we have the Spanish squared the trapezoid with the use of these posa platforms. Posas are something you see in Franciscan installments all around the New World. Posa comes from pause, or places of pausing. And so in Mexico, they've built actual little chapels for these posa features, but here they're just little platforms. So they square they colonize this space by squaring the trapezoid, so to speak. And what they would do is recapitulate the Christological mystery here from glorification, and literally this would be a processional in counterclockwise fashion to the incarnation, to the passion of Christ, through to the resurrection, and then there would be a prayer in the center of the plaza as well. So we can read out how this space was, it was initially an imperial space for the Incas, in which, there was a central right of reciprocity that was enacted in that space. And then this becomes appropriated by the Spanish, and, but the quizzical thing about this, of course, then is, how was this received? How was Catholicism received in this same space, right? And so, it's it's not just an architecture of conquest, it's an acknowledgement of the power of that space. And I would argue that in the process of the incorporation of Catholicism locally, that term incorporation, Catholicism itself is transformed in that process. Okay. So we have these calle reales, and what we see in other villages is the one that bisects the plaza most often is the one that bisects Anansaya and Urinsaya, the upper moiety and the lower moiety, spatially. So I think that's what's happening here. And if we remember, Anansaya was probably mostly pastoralist, and then Urinsaya was mostly agriculturalist. So this is something that we're going to be looking at in a lot more detail with excavation data in the future, but it's a hypothesis at this point. So we have a community that is split down the middle, quote unquote Andean style, but in this case, it's split down the middle largely between two very different lifeways, pastoralists on the one hand and agriculturalists on the other. And if we remember, this is the part that is on the I think I've got well, I'll show you here in a little bit. This is where the Bofedal runs through, so it's seasonally inundated. You have this big blank spot out here. This is probably just used as a big corral because it floods seasonally through here. Okay, so yeah, so you have half the population of pastoralists, the other half displaced from below, and they really carried a lot of the burden of resettlement. But as we'll see, the pastoralists, couldn't stay put either. So thinking about then the effect on this of resettlement and dwelling there, right? So we can think about buildings and what buildings do. This whole thing was premised on the idea that building these towns would civilize Andean peoples, right? This sort of deterministic view of things. But of course, as Thomas Guerin says here, buildings don't just sit there imposing themselves, they are forever objects of reinterpretation, narration, and representation. We deconstruct buildings materially and semiotically all the time, right? So they do stabilize social relations, they do channel movement and make certain behaviors repeat and persist. They, make certain kinds of interaction more likely, they make others less likely. They make your visual experience certain kinds of ways, but they're also remodeled and repurposed all the time. So I wanted to think about this dynamic in looking at the built environment, right? So he had this, Toledo had this idea that out of the built environment urbs, civitas, a civic community, would emerge. And this was literally drawn up by a predecessor of Toledo, Juan de Matienzo, who wrote a treatise called Governance of Peru, which by and large is the blueprint for the colonial order that Toledo implemented. And in that, he literally draws out an ideal plan for a Reducion village with the plaza in the center and the church. Here's the church here, and the church of the house of the priest and so forth. So how was this implemented then? And what were its effects? So yeah, buildings don't only impose themselves, but of course they do impose themselves. So the first part is about thinking about how that did work, the effect of resettlement on people's daily experience of movement and perception. So I did a network analysis and combined that with a viewshed analysis. So I'll move through this a little bit quickly. I don't need to go into the methodological details a lot, but basically we did a network graph where we traced out all the ways you could move through the settlement, through the streets and so forth. And then we routed the traffic from every house to every other house and every other building in the settlement, right? So we had 473 origin houses, actual houses, and then as I say, 507 destinations, which ends up being almost 250,000 routes that are all stacked on top of each other, right? So then you can add those all together, smush them all together, and then you end up with a density distribution of the everywhere to everywhere transit in the site. And so this is like all the possibilities for movement compressed together and added together in the network. And it looks like this. Now remember, they're not going to the plaza, they're going to everywhere from everywhere. And still the plazas, especially the Inca Plaza, is central, right? So that's really, really interesting. In other words, there's an intention here to make that plaza unavoidable, unless you're going to go out of your way, literally take a less than optimal path from point A to point B to point B. And these two major thoroughfares are pretty high traffic areas. We see this other area, which we think was the original entrance into the Inca Plaza down here, as a high traffic area as well. Okay, so that was just the movement part of it as an initial step. I mean, we're doing all kinds of other modeling where we're routing people to the plazas and so forth. That's going to be in the book as well. But as an initial look at the effect of the built environment itself, like what's the brute facticity of the built environment, not assuming any destination, but you know, from anywhere to anywhere, right? So then how can we combine that with visual experience? So here we're asking, you know, what features would be prominent as you move through the settlement? So here we took the architectural data and we got the building heights and projected them into the DEM. Didn't do roofs. I mean, we could do that, but it'd be a ton of work and it's probably gonna not resolve much anyway. So what we did is projected the building heights onto the digital elevation model, and then ran a viewshed analysis, like one viewshed, but 1,000 viewsheds, right? So we have 1,000 observer points distributed through the network, all right? And then we take the traffic in the everywhere to everywhere matrix, and that's the value we assign to the viewshed. So instead of 1 visible, 0 not visible, it's 0 not visible, and whatever the number of people that walked through that point in the everywhere to everywhere routing matrix, that value gets assigned to the visible areas for that viewshed for that point, right? So then white here is visible from a given point and black is not visible from a given point, right? So we run that 1,000 times. So you have a bunch of white and black here. White would get the value of the traffic from that observer point in the viewshed in the network. And then we smush all those together. We sum those all together. We get a traffic density weighted cumulative viewshed. And we ran that twice, one with an unrestricted viewshed and then one with a viewshed that's restricted to 50 meters to get a sense of near field visibility of architecture itself. And so this is what that smushed together, what we call the traffic density weighted cumulative viewshed looks like. That's just the raw output, right? And so that big empty space in the middle is highly visible, so they can keep an eye on their flocks. But the Inca Plaza or the Plaza Real is very, very visible, as is the other plaza and the entryway into the Plaza Real. So then we can sample that and do a hotspot analysis and look for significant hotspots of visibility, and we see that we have statistics, you know, some statistical significance of high visibility. So not only were these areas like unavoidable when moving through them, but they were visually prominent as well. So then if we, on the 50-meter radius viewshed, if we look at just the buildings, we can extract the values of just the outer shells of the buildings and get a sense of their visual ubiquity. And predictably, perhaps, you know, no big surprise, but the church and these chapels are among the hottest of the hotspots for visual experience, right? So the idea here is we can see the work of colonialism in the built environment itself. We can see the ideology, the semiotic ideology of Reducion embodied in the spatial structure of the Reducion itself, right? But keeping in mind that this plaza was an Inca plaza to begin with, right? So yeah, these areas were visually ubiquitous. They were like, their visibility was baked into the cake of the actual built environment itself, right? So here's a hotspot of the buildings overlaid with the traffic simulation, right? So that's Reducion at work, right, in the population. So, but it wasn't just in position, right? The Inca Plaza, the platform, the cancha are also central. And it's piggybacking on that former space of imperial incorporation by the Incas. So it's a sort of doubly colonized space and colonizing space with new patterns and new patterns of practice, sensory experience, and surveillance, and so forth. So just really briefly, I don't want to go. I've got a couple minutes here. On the interior spaces of domestic life. So as I said, we focused on these households that we believe were the curacas who are registered in these colonial censuses. So we know they were there. We know that Andean lords distinguished their homes by volume, size, and roof thatch height and thickness. And so we identified 4 candidates for curaca homes and excavated excavated them. What we see here then is a more formal space with EA 525 and EA 526 being like a kitchen. This is that that compound you saw before that gets it's an entire city block. So this is how colonialism proceeds through the figure of the Andean lord as a recognized authority locally. And what we see then is a lot of evidence for formal reception in the big house, and then preparation for what are probably, kind of commensal politics, feasting and so forth, in this outbuilding, which was the kitchen. This is just a dot density distribution of ceramics of all types, just to show you how much cleaner this was kept here. And then I've got a test pit down, punching down through the floor to see what's underneath. And we see that we have much denser material from the kitchen building. And then in the large, this is the large house. This is looking down through the excavations. We see this interesting repeating pattern of bench features all around the side of the home, where visitors could be kept. And this is so interesting in terms of the community dimension of this. So we, of course, worked very closely with the community, and they could read the interior spaces of these homes immediately, right? Oh, this is a patilla, the benches. This is where visitors would sit, and they would be received, right? Here's our sleeping platform. Here's a hearth over here. So we could read these with the help of our community members, and we've actually, co-presented with community members in our conference presentations and so forth, where we're reading out the interior spaces of these homes. This was the outbuilding, the kitchen for this curaca's home, where we have what might be a cuy run over here, a guinea pig pen over here, and then a hearth here, and just a lot of material. We see the same kind of pattern. I'll go through this really fast just to show you it's a repeating pattern. Here we have formal curaca home and outbuilding with its much denser material inside of it. Here you can actually see them excavating there when the drone flew over. And I'll go down through. You see the same pattern of the bench for receiving folks. This one had 2 storage features in the corners. And in the bottoms of those were these particular stones that the community members recognized as fertility amulets, which was just amazing to me. That this is where what you put in your storage feature so that your food doesn't run out. So a little bit on how dwelling in the Reducion would have been experienced. So what happens then through the 18th century is through the colonial era is a long story of decline of the population, so that by 1785 the population has fallen to 437 people from 1,015 in that first census. And now the upper moiety is less than half. Remember, before it was 2/3, and remember the upper half was primarily pastoralist. So there's a major shift here. Most of the Anansaya people have left, and then you're left with these agriculturalists up here in Urinsaya. but an overall reduction of 57% from the 17th century. So this is driven mostly by, I mean, there's a lowering, of course, through the colonial era, through the introduction of European pathogens. There's an overall lowering. But what we see here locally is an outmigration of the pastoralist population. And we see this in this 62% decrease in Anansaya, which is primarily pastoralists, and a 21% decrease, a much lower percentage decrease amongst Udi and Saya.
So Steve, not to interrupt you, Steve, but we were a little over time here. If you could wrap up, that would just be fabulous.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, so what we did then is we can see where people are, where they moved out to, and they moved out to these pastoralist settlements way out in the countryside, and then moved down to the village of Tuti. So that's where we were going. So I just had a few more slides anyway. Sorry, guys. So I'm happy to take questions.
Wow, that was really fabulous. Thank you so much, Steve. Wow, that's so pro, those images you're getting, like, wow. So we'll stop. The recording has stopped. And for folks who need to go, it's 12.